Here's a bit of history for you brothers to sink your teeth into. It's entitled Early Biological War on Native Americans. Another name for Native Americans is the so-called North American Indians, which happen to be out of the tribe of Gad of the nation of Israel. Now, you've always heard us speak about how the so-called white man gave smallpox-infested blankets to the so-called North American Indians when they came over here to America. And it was part of their plan to try to wipe out the so-called North American Indian. And in this webpage I have proof of some of those wicked deeds. Now if you type in early biological war on Native Americans, you'll go right to this page right here. You'll go right to the web page. This is it right here. Now what I did was take some of the highlights into this lesson. It says bioterrorism, public health, and the law. Law 801, healthcare law seminar. Professor Verniliella R. Randall. Early biological war on Native Americans. Jeffrey Amherst and smallpox blankets by Peter D. Errico. Lord Jeffrey Amherst letters discussing germ warfare against American Indians. Now, one of the reasons why I'm doing this lesson is because in the next lesson I'm going to show you that part of this so-called New World Order is to bring germ warfare against you Israelites, against you tribes. Now the same way the so-called white man did it back then, the same way he's going to do it now. And that's part of that Georgia Guidestones commandment number 1 that says maintain humanity under 500 million. So back then, in this piece of history that I'm about to read, the so-called white man was trying to do away with the so-called North American Indian so they could get their land, which they eventually did, and get all their resources. But they was really trying to wipe them out. And that's what they're going to try to do again. And that's why if you go in the book of Matthew, the 24th chapter, the 7th verse, this is what Yahushua said. He said, for nation shall rise against nation. The so-called white man, his nationality is Edom. We, according to the Bible, our nationality is Israel, or Israelites. So once again, Edom trying to rise against Israel. And kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in divers places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. Now the word I want you to look or focus your attention on is pestilences. Now if you look that word up, this is from, I believe it's dictionary.com, or it might be the Merriam-Webster, I'm not sure. It's a still that I took. Pestilence, definition of pestilence, a contagious or infectious epidemic disease that is virulent and devastating, especially bubonic plague. And all you have to do is type in bubonic plague to get a reference to that. But that's what a pestilence is. And going back to the scripture, this is what Yahushua said would be the sign of his coming, pestilence. So what I'm doing is reaching back in history to show you that it's in the so-called white man's nature to bring a pestilence, because basically he's the instrument of destruction. Alright? That's why the Most High created him. The Most High created him to destroy. So let's go into this history here. Lord Jeffrey Amherst's letters discussing germ warfare against American Indians. Lord Jeffrey Amherst was Commanding General of British forces in North America during the final battles of the so-called French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763. Here's a picture of this devil right here. Alright, this is what he looks like. Straight up Edomite. He won victories against the French to acquire Canada for England and helped make England the world's chief colonizer at the conclusion of the 7 Years' War among the colonial powers. Now, an example of the colonial powers, you go back to the 7 heads mentioned in Revelation, the 13th chapter. You have the Greeks, the Romans, the Germania Major, Germania Minor, the Spanish, the French, and the British. And that's what was happening here. Alright, you had the war between the French and the British for colonization, basically rulership of the world. And pretty much the French was defeated and the British took over. So basically around the 1700s the French was ruling, but then came in the 1800s and the British started to rule. And one of the main key players was this guy Jeffrey Amherst. As you see here, it says Lord Jeffrey Amherst. So basically, going back to this, you have the 6th head, as the scriptures mention the 7 heads. You have the 6th head being the French fighting against the 7th head being the British. Then it mentions an 8th head which shall go into perdition. That's in the book of Revelation. That 8th head is America, which came out of the 7, which is the British. That's all mentioned in the book of Revelation. But our focus right now is this little tidbit of history here, dealing with this guy Amherst and his attempt to wipe out, or to try and wipe out, the so-called North American Indians, which happens to be of the tribe of Gad of the nation of Israel. Lord Jeffrey Amherst was Commanding General of British forces in North America during the final battles of the so-called French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763. He won victories against the French to acquire Canada for England and helped make England the world's chief colonizer at the conclusion of the 7 Years' War among the colonial powers, 1756 to 1763. Despite his fame, and by the way, the town of Amherst, Massachusetts was named after this demon, after this devil. It says, despite his fame, Jeffrey Amherst's name became tarnished by stories of smallpox-infected blankets used as germ warfare against American Indians. These stories are reported, for example, in Carl Wallman's Atlas of the North American Indian, NY, Facts on File, 1985. So if anyone can get that reference, that's where this, or anyone can get that book rather, that's where this reference was taken from. Wallman writes in reference to a siege of Fort Pitt, Pittsburgh, by Chief Pontiac's forces during the summer of 1763, and that's another name. You can Google Chief Pontiac, find out a little bit more about that. Captain Simeon Equa had bought time by sending smallpox-infected blankets and handkerchiefs to the Indians surrounding the fort. So that was part of their warfare, and this guy has the nerve to have the name Simeon, which just happens to be another tribe of the nation of Israel. But anyway, that was part of their warfare against the so-called North American Indians, and that's part of the reason why they defeated them the so-called North American Indians, because they were known for war, the so-called North American Indians, and basically Esau and his valiant attempt to destroy him settled for tactics like this, sending smallpox infected blankets and handkerchiefs to the Indians surrounding the fort. An early example of biological warfare, which started an epidemic among them. See, so even this reference says that that was one of the earliest, or an early example of biological warfare. So if they did it back then, you think they're not going to do it now? Of course they are. If you go in the book of Psalms 83, one of the main nations that's trying to destroy the Israelites, which is us, is the nation of Edom. It mentions them. It says the nation of Edom in Psalm 83. It gives you a list of the nations trying to destroy Israel, and the nation of Edom is the main one on top. And that's what they were trying to do back then. It says an early example of biological warfare, which started an epidemic among them. Amherst himself had encouraged this tactic in a letter to Ukiah, page 108. Some people have doubted these stories. Other people believing the stories nevertheless assert that the infected blankets were not intentionally distributed to the Indians, or that Lord Jeff himself is not to blame for the germ warfare tactic. Excuse me, which is basically bullshit, because this guy Jeffrey Amherst, basically his main goal was to try to destroy the so-called North American Indian and claim their land and resources for Great Britain. That was his main goal. These are the pivotal letters Colonel Henry Bouquet to General Amherst, dated 13 July 1763, suggests in a postscript the distribution of blankets to inoculate the Indians. And if you look that word inoculate up, basically it means to give them a disease, essentially to kill them. And that was the main goal of the distribution, I should say, of those blankets. Amherst to Bouquet, dated 16 July 1763, approves this plan in postscript and suggests as well as to try every other method that can serve to extirpate this execrable race. Now, extirpate, when you look that word up, it means to totally destroy, totally annihilate. And the word execrable race, the word execrable meaning undesirable, totally undesirable. And they're talking about the so-called North American Indian here. Alright, so you can look these words up, extirpate and execrable. So there's your proof. Alright, you know, something short to the point. There's proof of Esau, Edom, the so-called white man, the devil, trying to eliminate the so-called North American Indian, the tribe of Gad, with a tactic known as biological warfare. Through what? Smallpox infested blankets. And if you think they're not going to do it again with a more sophisticated form of biological warfare against you tribes, then you're sadly mistaken, because that's part of their history.